Hi, and welcome to another Organization Behavior Capsule lecture. Today we need to talk about groups. I think first we should start with the idea of why we form groups. That organizations today tend to put us into all kinds of various ad hoc or permanent groupings. We're in departments, we're on committees, we're on hot teams that go in and solve problems. That business never really was an individual game, but now it's clearly a group sport, or team sport, if you will. One of the reasons for this is that we've got some pretty good data on group performance over time. For example, a heterogeneous group on a decision-making task tends to outperform a homogeneous group on the same task, and also tends to outperform individuals. However, there is a counter to that, and the counter is that a high-performing individual will tend to do better than groups, and the groups even of which they are a part of. So it is a double-edged sword. We always need to decide the appropriate circumstances under which we need to use a group. On the other hand, homogeneous groups have some things going for them as well. I mean, look at your group of friends. They tend to talk like you, to think like you, to dress like you, because homogeneous groups are a lot easier to get along with. There tends to be less social friction. On the other hand, they tend to fall victim to various decision-making problems. So when we form these groups, we always need to keep in mind what we know about group dynamics, as this field is called, and exactly how these things form, and what are the pluses and minuses, the pros and cons of putting our people together in teams. First, I think we should start with the origin of some of the research here. How do groups form? Well, the process is described as forming. Not surprisingly, we put a bunch of people together. They start the process of figuring out how the group is going to work, how it's going to run. They do storming, which is the whole stormy period, first part of a relationship. We're trying to get an understanding of how the group is going to form, how it's going to run. The third idea is norming. Norming is the process of forming norms, not surprisingly. And then finally, the fourth stage is performing. This was done by Bruce Tuckman, by the way, but in about 65, he talked about this idea of storming, forming, norming, and performing. However, if you look at in your textbook, the later models also include adjourning as a fifth stage, because the group's got to break up eventually. The Beatles broke up, after all. So we look at these stages of group development and notice that we're paying conscious attention to what's happening here. One of the mistakes that you guys tend to make when you're forming work groups for classes is that you tend not to be aware of the process that's going on. You just, let's get together and talk about this. So you don't go through these stages clearly of storming, forming, norming, and performing. That if you sat down and said, okay, what are my goals for this group? What do we intend to accomplish? All those kinds of things, you'd have a much better group experience than the one that you have now. Because what happens, there's all these dysfunctions of groups as well. Chris Argyris talked about these ideas of defensive routines. These aren't just for individuals, they happen quite often in groups where people withdraw, they're sitting in a corner, they're not talking, and you got to confront that head on. Why is this going on? Why are you behaving in such a way? But very few of us are sensitive enough to actually go about this. So groups tend to dissolve into things like turf wars. That's why there's research on things like group size. That if you have a group of about 6, it's ideal. But there's been an argument whether it should be 5 or 7 rather than 6, because in a group of 6 you can have a tie. A group of 5 or 7 you're going to have 3, 2, 4, 1, that kind of thing. And of course, groups form subgroups. The jargon here is in-group versus out-group relationships. The in-group, of course, is those folks who tend to be in charge. Remember your cliques from high school. That's what they were. I mean, the jocks were part of that in-group. The out-group is pretty much everybody else. And this is going to happen no matter what your group size is. There will be subdivisions. The way to control for that, of course, is to keep everything flowing and try to get the idea that everybody needs to participate and pull their weight. Because what the economists call the free rider problem crops up quite frequently. You've seen it in your groups, where you've got 5 people assigned to a task. One of them shows up, maybe just brings the beer. And that person, really doesn't contribute to the task. They're freeloading basically on what you guys are doing. And how do you confront that? Well, in the workplace, my students always give me the idea, well, you can fire them. Probably not. The boss can probably fire them, but you probably don't have that authority, and firing people is a lot tougher than it seems. And it doesn't really serve that much of a purpose because, we need to get that person and get their performance. They're on the group for a reason, not just to fill the space. Richard Hackman did some research and talked about what groups need to do to be successful. First of all, you need to be a real team. Said that shared tasks, clear boundaries, clarify who's inside, who's outside, that kind of thing, so that we have a clear circle defining group membership. That there needs to be a compelling direction, that everybody sees the need to go where this group is going to go. That there needs to be an enabling structure. What happens is the group needs to be formed in such a way that people have official roles within the group that serve to keep the task of the group in focus and whether or not the group is actually attending to that task. There's a supportive context, which means that the group has to have support from the larger organization and those roles recognized. And finally, there needs to be expert coaching. When we get to start talking to some of the decision literature, you're going to see that we quite often advocate that you bring in a facilitator to actually help you keep the group on task. And that person's role is to be the expert coach, to teach people how to run their groups and how to go about getting the task accomplished. So, you've got to remember that when you're starting these groups, we're starting as individuals and we're giving something up. We're having to talk to people about who we are, what we're up to. We're giving away some autonomy to join the group, so hopefully we're getting something in return. Part of that, is just fulfilling our need for affiliation. Because remember, we do have that we have to cope with. And when the group really starts gelling, what you're seeing is what's called group cohesion. But group cohesion is really one of the true double-edged swords when we start talking about groups. Because sometimes the superordinate goal of the group gets misplaced. All organizations suffer from this idea that the tasks of the group, the day-to-day activities of the group tend to supersede what the organization itself is up to. Well, in about 1961, I think it was, William White, 1962-ish, the guy who wrote the book The Organization Man, coined the term groupthink. And the way he defined it was this idea that when people start thinking together, he talked about rationalized conformity. Let me see if I can read this here. An open, articulate philosophy which holds that group values are not only expedient, but right and good as well. That was kind of ignored for a while, but about 10 years later, about 1971, a guy by the name of Irving Janis took it up and started really researching what we meant by groupthink. And I'm going to spend a little time on this because I think this dysfunction of the group is something that you need to be aware of, because the consequences of it can be terrible for the organization and for the members of the group. What Janis started looking at was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. He looked at the Bay of Pigs incident involving the Kennedy White House. Later than that, he looked at LBJ's escalation of commitment in terms of the Vietnam War, and found out that in each one of these situations, a bit of groupthink was taking place, which was not only group cohesion, but it was massively dysfunctional group cohesion. That the group starts to overestimate its own power and influence. Well, we're the brightest guys in the room. Of course, we know what we're doing. There tends to be closed-mindedness when we start rationalizing and stereotyping. Well, anyone outside of here is probably one of our enemies anyways. And then the third stage, there are pressures towards conformity. We engage in self-censorship. We stop talking about alternatives. We start nodding our heads. And people will become mind guards voluntarily. What they will do is they'll start enforcing that conformity. And by doing so, what they're doing is they're stopping new ideas from getting into the group context. And at that point in time, we've got full-blown groupthink happening, and truly horrendous things can happen. Because we're no longer accepting outside information, we're starting to nod our heads, dissension, discussion, all this goes out the window, and we are so convinced that we're right that we're just going to plow down that path. And it said high cohesiveness, structural fault, situational context. Well, how do we do this? Well, in about 93, I think it was, Ray Aldag and Fuller talked about what we need to do here. You need to make sure that you're aware that groupthink can occur. You need to be aware of its symptoms. You need to make sure that discussion is happening. You probably want to appoint a devil's advocate, someone who looks at what the organization is intended to do, looks at what the group decision is, and tackles it point by point and takes it on. That way you've got a formal discussion of what's happening. We have formal dissension in the role of this devil's advocate, and therefore we can be aware that groupthink might be occurring and short-circuit that process before it takes hold entirely. I think that's about as far as I need to go today. Read your books. If you have any questions, let me know. But for today, I'm Dwight, and have yourself a good day. Bye-bye.